Imagine two brilliant military minds locked in a battle that would decide the fate of an entire civilization. On one side stands Julius Caesar, the ambitious Roman general whose name would echo through history. On the other, Vercingetorix, a young Gallic chieftain with fire in his eyes and freedom in his heart. The year is 52 BCE, and what's about to unfold at Alesia isn't just any ordinary siege. This is a battle where Caesar will pull off one of the most audacious military maneuvers in history, building not one but two massive walls around an entire hilltop fortress, trapping both his enemies and himself in a deadly game of survival. But here's the twist that makes this story absolutely mind-blowing. Caesar doesn't just have to defeat the warriors inside Alesia. He has to face a relief army of over 250,000 Gallic warriors coming to break the siege. Imagine being surrounded by your enemies, then choosing to surround yourself with walls, knowing that an army 4 times your size is marching toward you. This is either the greatest military gamble in history or the most spectacular example of tactical genius ever recorded. What you're about to witness is more than just another ancient battle. This is the moment that shaped the destiny of Europe itself. The Battle of Alesia represents the final clash between two worlds, the rising power of Rome and the fierce independence of the Celtic tribes. Julius Caesar had been campaigning in Gaul for 7 years, conquering tribe after tribe, building his reputation and his fortune. But now, for the first time, he faced a unified Gallic resistance under a leader who could match his strategic brilliance. Vercingetorix had studied Roman tactics, learned their weaknesses, and was determined to drive the invaders from his homeland forever. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether Gaul would remain free or become another jewel in Rome's expanding crown. This is the story of how one of history's greatest generals faced his greatest challenge, and how a young Gallic warrior nearly changed the course of Western civilization. To understand the magnitude of what happened at Alesia, we need to go back to the beginning of 52 BCE, when everything changed for Caesar's Gallic campaigns. For 6 years, Caesar had been systematically conquering Gallic tribes, using a combination of military might and political manipulation to divide and conquer his enemies. His legions had become the most feared fighting force in Europe, and his own reputation had grown to legendary proportions. But Caesar made a crucial mistake that winter. Believing Gaul was firmly under Roman control, he left for northern Italy to conduct political business, leaving his legions scattered across the conquered territories. This was the moment Vercingetorix had been waiting for. This young nobleman of the Arverni tribe was everything Caesar hadn't expected in a Gallic leader. While most tribal chiefs were content to fight individual battles for personal glory, Vercingetorix possessed a strategic mind that could see the bigger picture. He understood that the Gauls' greatest weakness had always been their inability to unite against a common enemy. Each tribe fought independently, making them easy prey for Roman divide-and-conquer tactics. Vercingetorix began his rebellion with a masterstroke of psychological warfare. He didn't just call for military resistance, he appealed to something deeper. He spoke of Gallic identity, of the ancient freedoms their ancestors had enjoyed, of the sacred groves and traditions that Roman occupation threatened to destroy. His message spread like wildfire across the tribes. Warriors who had never fought beside each other suddenly found themselves united under a single banner. The rebellion exploded across Gaul with shocking violence. Roman merchants and settlers who had felt safe under Caesar's protection were massacred. Towns that had collaborated with Rome were burned to the ground. Most importantly, Vercingetorix demonstrated something that stunned even Caesar's veterans. The Gauls could fight with discipline and coordination that matched Roman military precision. When news of the uprising reached Caesar in northern Italy, he understood immediately that this was different from every other Gallic revolt he had faced. This wasn't a collection of angry tribes lashing out in rage. This was a coordinated military campaign led by someone who understood both Gallic strengths and Roman weaknesses. Caesar had to make a choice that would define the rest of his career: retreat to Roman territory and abandon years of conquest, or march north and face the greatest military challenge of his life. Caesar's response to the Gallic rebellion revealed why he was considered one of history's greatest military minds. Instead of rushing directly into Gaul with whatever forces he could gather, he took time to analyze his enemy and develop a comprehensive strategy. He realized that fighting Vercingetorix would require more than just superior Roman discipline and equipment. He was facing an opponent who had learned from 7 years of watching Roman tactics and had adapted accordingly. Vercingetorix's strategy was revolutionary for Gallic warfare. Instead of seeking the glorious pitched battles that Celtic warriors traditionally craved, he implemented a campaign of strategic withdrawal and scorched-earth tactics. When Caesar's legions approached a Gallic settlement, they would find it abandoned and burned, with all supplies destroyed and the population evacuated to fortified positions. This forced the Romans to carry all their provisions with them, slowing their advance and stretching their supply lines dangerously thin. The psychological aspect of this strategy was equally brilliant. Gallic warriors were used to fighting for immediate victory or death. Convincing them to burn their own homes and retreat before the enemy required a level of leadership and persuasion that few chieftains possessed. But Vercingetorix understood that short-term sacrifice could lead to long-term victory. Every day that Caesar's army marched through empty, burned countryside was another day his supplies dwindled and his men's morale suffered. Caesar adapted his own tactics in response. He split his forces into multiple columns, making it impossible for Vercingetorix to predict where the main Roman threat would emerge. He also began incorporating more Gallic auxiliaries into his army, tribes that remained loyal to Rome either through fear or political calculation. These allies provided crucial intelligence about Vercingetorix's movements and helped Caesar understand the psychological dynamics of the rebellion. The campaign became a deadly game of chess played across the forests and hills of central Gaul. Caesar would attempt to force a decisive battle while Vercingetorix would withdraw, harass Roman supply lines, and wait for the perfect moment to strike. Both commanders knew that time was a crucial factor. Caesar needed to end the rebellion quickly before it spread further or attracted support from Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine. Vercingetorix needed to avoid decisive defeat while building the strength necessary to drive Rome from Gaul forever. This strategic dance continued for months, with neither commander able to gain a decisive advantage. But both men knew that eventually, circumstances would force a final confrontation that would determine the fate of Gaul. The turning point that would lead to Alesia began with what appeared to be a Roman disaster. Caesar had been pursuing Vercingetorix's army when the Gallic leader suddenly turned and attacked the Roman column at Gergovia, an Arverni stronghold. The battle was a shocking defeat for Caesar, one of the few times in his career that his legions broke and fled from the field. Roman casualties were severe, and for the first time since arriving in Gaul, Caesar's aura of invincibility was shattered. But Vercingetorix's victory at Gergovia created an unexpected problem. Success brought thousands of additional warriors flocking to his banner, but it also attracted chieftains who were more interested in personal glory than strategic thinking. These new allies pressured Vercingetorix to abandon his careful strategy of withdrawal and engage Caesar in the kind of direct confrontation that Gallic warriors craved. Caesar, meanwhile, used his defeat as a strategic opportunity. He began a carefully orchestrated withdrawal toward the Roman province, making it appear that he was abandoning his conquest of Gaul entirely. This movement served multiple purposes. It drew Vercingetorix away from his base of support in central Gaul, consolidated Caesar's scattered legions into a single powerful force, and created the impression among the Gallic tribes that Rome was in full retreat. The deception worked perfectly. Convinced that Caesar was fleeing Gaul in defeat, Vercingetorix's war council decided to attack the withdrawing Romans and destroy Caesar's army completely. This decision represented a fundamental shift in Gallic strategy, from the patient guerrilla campaign that had been so successful to the kind of direct assault that played to Roman strengths. Vercingetorix recognized the danger of this change in strategy, but the political pressure from his allies left him with little choice. He had united the Gallic tribes through promises of victory, and those tribes now demanded the decisive battle they had been promised. The young Gallic leader found himself trapped between strategic wisdom and political necessity. The stage was set when Vercingetorix chose to make his stand at Alesia, a hilltop fortress of the Mandubi tribe. From a purely defensive standpoint, Alesia was an excellent choice. The oppidum sat on top of a high plateau, surrounded by steep slopes and protected by strong walls. It commanded the surrounding countryside and had sufficient supplies to withstand a lengthy siege. Most importantly, its position allowed Vercingetorix to send messengers throughout Gaul, calling for a massive relief army that would crush Caesar's forces between the anvil of Alesia's defenses and the hammer of Gallic reinforcements. When Caesar arrived at Alesia and surveyed the massive hilltop fortress, his officers expected him to either attempt a direct assault or continue his withdrawal to safer Roman territory. Instead, Caesar made a decision that left both his own men and his enemies stunned. He announced that they would besiege Alesia, but not in any conventional manner. Caesar planned to build a complete ring of fortifications around the entire plateau, cutting off all communication and supply to the fortress. The engineering challenge was staggering. Alesia's plateau was over 2 miles in circumference, protected by steep slopes, rivers, and marshland. Building a continuous line of fortifications around such terrain seemed impossible, especially with a hostile army watching from above and the constant threat of attacks from Gallic reinforcements. But Caesar's legions had spent years perfecting the art of military engineering. Each legion carried specialized tools and included soldiers trained in construction techniques. More importantly, Caesar had cultivated a culture where his men took pride in accomplishing the impossible. When their commander announced an audacious plan, they responded with enthusiasm rather than doubt. The construction of what the Romans called the circumvallation began immediately. Working in shifts around the clock, the legions dug a massive trench 15 feet deep and 15 feet wide. piling the excavated earth into a rampart on the Roman side. Behind this primary fortification, they built a timber palisade topped with sharpened stakes. At regular intervals, they constructed towers that allowed Roman artillery to dominate the surrounding area. But Caesar's masterstroke was still to come. Recognizing that Vercingetorix would inevitably call for relief forces, Caesar ordered his men to construct a second line of fortifications facing outward from their camps. This contravallation was even more elaborate than the inner wall, designed to protect the Roman army from attack by the massive relief army that would surely come. The result was one of the most remarkable engineering achievements in military history. Caesar had essentially built a fortified city around Alesia, with his army occupying the space between two massive defensive walls. The outer wall protected them from relief armies, while the inner wall prevented anyone from escaping the fortress. Both the besiegers and the besieged were now trapped in a deadly embrace that could only end with the complete victory of one side or the other. As Caesar's walls rose higher each day, the situation inside Alesia became increasingly desperate. Vercingetorix had gathered approximately 80,000 warriors inside the fortress, along with the civilian population of the surrounding area. This massive concentration of people quickly overwhelmed the settlement's food supplies, creating a crisis that Caesar's siege was designed to exploit. The psychological pressure on both sides was immense. Inside Alesia, Gallic warriors who were accustomed to fighting in the open found themselves trapped behind walls, watching helplessly as Roman fortifications grew stronger each day. Food rationing began almost immediately, and the reality of slow starvation became a daily concern. Vercingetorix faced the terrible challenge of maintaining morale among his followers while making increasingly difficult decisions about resource allocation. Outside the walls, Caesar's legions faced their own psychological challenges. They were completely cut off from Roman territory, dependent entirely on the supplies they had brought with them. If Vercingetorix's relief army proved too strong to resist, every Roman soldier at Alesia would face death or slavery. The audacity of their commander's strategy was inspiring, but it also meant that retreat was no longer an option. Caesar used this pressure to forge his army into an even more cohesive fighting force. He made it clear that their survival depended entirely on the success of his plan, creating a shared sense of destiny that bound officers and common soldiers together. Daily construction work on the fortifications gave every man a personal investment in the defenses, while the visible progress of the walls provided tangible proof that their seemingly impossible mission was achievable. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix made increasingly desperate attempts to break the siege. Night raids against the Roman construction crews achieved little except to slow the wall-building process. Attempts to fill in sections of the Roman trenches were met by devastating crossbow fire from the towers. Most frustratingly, every messenger sent to coordinate with the relief army had to run a gauntlet of Roman patrols, making communication with the outside world nearly impossible. As the siege entered its second month, both commanders knew that time was running out. The relief army was surely assembling, but food supplies inside Alesia were reaching critical levels. The decisive phase of the battle was approaching, and both Caesar and Vercingetorix began making their final preparations for the confrontation that would determine the fate of Gaul. When the Gallic relief army finally appeared on the hills surrounding Caesar's fortifications, it was a sight that would have terrified any other Roman commander in history. Modern estimates suggest that over 250,000 warriors from across Gaul had answered Vercingetorix's call for assistance. This was not just an army, it was an entire nation in arms, representing the largest military force ever assembled by the Celtic peoples. The diversity of this force was both its strength and its weakness. Warriors had come from dozens of different tribes, each with their own fighting traditions, languages, and loyalties. Some were heavily armed infantry, equipped with mail armor and long shields, while others were light skirmishers or cavalry specialists. The sight of so many different tribal banners and war paint patterns created a spectacle of barbaric magnificence that must have been both beautiful and terrifying. Caesar's response to this overwhelming force revealed his genius as both a tactician and a leader of men. Instead of allowing his soldiers to be intimidated by the sheer size of the enemy army, he reminded them that numbers alone did not win battles. Roman discipline, superior equipment, and defensive advantages could multiply their effective strength far beyond their actual numbers. Most importantly, he pointed out that the Gallic army's diversity would make coordination difficult, especially in the chaos of battle. The Roman fortifications that had seemed like an ambitious engineering project now proved their worth as military assets. The outer wall provided elevated firing positions that allowed Roman artillery to reach deep into the Gallic assembly areas. The ditches and obstacles forced any attacking force to advance slowly under heavy fire, while the multiple lines of defense gave the Romans numerous opportunities to break enemy momentum. But Caesar's most brilliant insight was recognizing that the relief army's arrival had actually created an opportunity rather than just a threat. The Gallic forces were now divided between those inside Alesia and those outside the Roman walls. Coordination between these two forces would be extremely difficult, and Caesar's position between them might allow him to defeat each group separately if he could maintain the initiative. The stage was now set for one of the most complex battles in ancient warfare, with three separate armies maneuvering for advantage in a confined space where tactical genius would matter more than raw numbers. The climactic Battle of Alesia began with a coordinated assault that demonstrated just how much the Gallic tribes had learned about military organization under Vercingetorix's leadership. As dawn broke, attacks began simultaneously from three directions. The relief army assaulted Caesar's outer walls. Vercingetorix led his warriors out of Alesia against the inner fortifications, and a third force attempted to infiltrate the Roman position through a gap in the northern defenses. Caesar found himself facing the ultimate test of generalship, commanding a battle where his army was literally surrounded and attacked from all sides simultaneously. Lesser commanders would have been overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation, but Caesar had spent his entire career preparing for moments like this. He had positioned his reserves carefully, established clear command structures, and most importantly, had instilled in his men the confidence that victory was possible even under seemingly impossible circumstances. The fighting was brutal and desperate. At the outer wall, waves of Gallic warriors threw themselves against Roman fortifications with the fury of men fighting for their homeland's freedom. The defenders responded with the disciplined volleys and coordinated tactics that had made Roman legions the most feared fighting force in the world. Bodies piled up in the ditches as each assault was repelled, only to be followed by another wave of attackers. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix led what he knew might be his final charge. The young chieftain who had united Gaul's tribes fought with the desperate courage of a man who understood that defeat meant not just personal death, but the end of Gallic independence forever. His warriors, weakened by months of siege but inspired by their leader's example, threw themselves against the inner Roman walls with reckless bravery. The northern infiltration proved to be the most dangerous threat. A force of picked Gallic warriors had discovered a weakness in Caesar's fortifications and was on the verge of breaking through when Caesar himself led a cavalry charge that shattered their advance. This moment, when Caesar personally led the decisive assault that saved his army from disaster, became one of the most famous incidents of his entire career. The tide of battle turned when the relief army's coordinated assault began to falter under the relentless pressure of Roman defense. The Gallic forces, magnificent in their initial charge, lacked the disciplined reserves necessary to sustain their attack against prepared fortifications. As casualties mounted and no breakthrough appeared imminent, individual tribes began withdrawing from the battle, concerned more about preserving their own warriors than maintaining the unified assault. When the dust settled over the battlefield of Alesia, the course of Western civilization had been forever altered. Vercingetorix, recognizing that continued resistance would only lead to the massacre of his remaining followers, made the ultimate sacrifice. He rode out of Alesia alone, threw down his weapons at Caesar's feet, and surrendered himself to save his people. This act of personal courage marked the end of organized Gallic resistance and secured Caesar's conquest of an entire nation. The victory at Alesia established Caesar as one of history's greatest military commanders and provided him with the wealth and reputation necessary to challenge the Roman Republic itself. Within a decade, he would cross the Rubicon and transform Rome from a republic into an empire. The golden slaves from Gaul would fund his civil war, while the loyalty of his veteran legions would carry him to supreme power. But the true significance of Alesia extends far beyond one man's political ambitions. The battle marked the moment when Celtic civilization in Western Europe began its transformation into something recognizably Roman. The languages, laws, architecture, and customs that would shape European culture for the next 1,000 years all trace their origins to Caesar's victory over Vercingetorix. The engineering marvel of Caesar's double walls became a model for siege warfare that would be studied and copied for centuries. The tactical brilliance of fighting a defensive battle while surrounded has influenced military thinking up to the present day. Most importantly, the political consequences of Alesia rippled through history, setting in motion the events that would create the Roman Empire and, ultimately, the foundations of Western civilization itself. If you found this incredible tale of military genius and heroic sacrifice as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more epic stories from history. Let me know in the comments, do you think Vercingetorix's surrender was an act of wisdom or weakness? And what other legendary battles from ancient history would you like to see covered next? The ancient world is full of these incredible stories of human courage and strategic brilliance, and I can't wait to share more of them with you.